That Prime Minister Mark Carney will confirm the appointment at the National Gallery in the next 30 minutes. As the monarch's representative in Canada, the Governor-General has key responsibilities, including dissolving Parliament and calling an election, swearing the Prime Minister and Cabinet into office, and granting royal assent when a bill becomes law. Arbour's appointment is Mark Carney's most high-profile selection since taking office. Now, we have this story covered from all angles for you as we wait for the Prime Minister to speak at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Standing by in our nation's capital as we prepare for the announcement, the CBC's Karina Roman, Janice McGregor and Catherine Cullen. We do want to begin at the National Gallery, where the official announcement will take place shortly. And that's where we find the CBC's Karina Roman. Hello, Karina. Okay, so just in the last few minutes, we understand that Louise Arbour, a very distinguished figure, will take on this role. What more can you tell us about her as we wait for this official confirmation from the Prime Minister?
Well, yesterday we had been told, no names of course, but we had been told that it was going to be a woman and it was going to be a bilingual woman, and bilingual in terms of French and English, because that was an issue with the current Governor-General, Mary Simon, in terms of the ability to speak French. So certainly Louise Arbour fits those two criteria. She also, of course, there's no doubt you can say that she has an extensive legal expertise as a former Supreme Court Justice, someone who probably understands the Canadian Constitution very well, and has had to be, as a Supreme Court Justice, very impartial. But she, of course, is also known as her role when she was a chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, in terms of prosecuting the war crimes in Rwanda, but also Slobodan Milosevic. So well known for those roles that she played, and known to be someone who can be outspoken, including being impartial. So on both fronts, I guess with that international reputation, she brings to the role some global prestige, I guess you could say, sort of a heavyweight presence in terms of a reputation. But she's also, more recently, I mean, she didn't stop after that. She was enlisted by the Trudeau government to do the inquiry. In 2022, she did a report on the sexual misconduct issues and pervasive culture that was an issue with the Canadian Armed Forces. So she has not rested since her global jobs. And so it's interesting that she had this role of looking into sexual misconduct into the Canadian Armed Forces and issuing that groundbreaking report on it, and now is or will be the commander-in-chief for the country. So that's an interesting juxtaposition as well. She does have a family as well. She has two daughters, one who is a prominent lawyer and who actually ran federally for the NDP. So interesting figure all around, and certainly someone who comes with a lot of expertise, and people will be probably parsing many of the things she has said over the years once she takes on the role.
A lot to talk about in terms of her accomplishments, for certain, but let's also take our viewers to the scene, which is where you are right now, where the announcement is set to take place. What is the mood and atmosphere like at this moment, as of course we wait for the arrival of the new Governor-General and the Prime Minister to make this announcement?
Well, it is all a buzz. It was earlier a buzz before the news came out of who it would be. People, rampant speculation, of course, people throwing out names. Now people just getting geared up for the event. Although typical Ottawa style, Arthi, we are at the National Gallery, and there are still people coming to actually visit the gallery as a gallery, and finding that they have to sort of take a different route into it. So life goes on at the gallery in that way. But the Prime Minister and the new Governor-General will come up the hallway behind me, the ramp behind me. You see those Canadian flags, and go to the atrium where you see the picture you've got up now is floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Ottawa River. That's where the announcement will be made officially, and questions will be taken, at least by the Prime Minister. I don't know at this point whether the Governor-General or the new Governor-General, the Governor-General designate, however you want to say it, will be answering questions or not. But that's where they will make the announcement and take questions from the media. And then the event is done. And then we can all go on with our analysis of the choice for the new Governor-General.
Karina, thank you for this. That is the CBC's Karina Roman at the National Gallery in Ottawa. Okay, so as we do wait for the official confirmation from the Prime Minister of Louise Arbour as Canada's next Governor-General, I do want to bring in the CBC's Janice McGregor in our Ottawa bureau. Okay, so this, of course, as we've been discussing with Karina, is a non-partisan role. Something, of course, that Arbour does have a lot of experience with, but the selection can be quite political here.
Yeah, so let's pick right up where Karina left off there and talk about her arriving at Rideau Hall in this moment in the present government context, because we know, obviously, the Prime Minister, a lot of his key ministers and advisors, if you tune into the House of Commons on any given day, all the opposition leaders, the Speaker, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada now, and King Charles himself, all male. So installing Louise Arbour at Rideau Hall, that could be somewhat of a counterbalance on the gender equity front. Mark Carney earlier this year, of course, had said absolutely that his Governor General pick would be completely bilingual. That describes Louise Arbour, bilingue bien sûr. But once we tuck into some of the other skills and experiences that are required if we are to sort of imagine what a Governor General could and should be, you get much beyond identity politics. Yes, people sometimes analyze the tradition of going back and forth between Francophone and Anglophone in this country. Of course, Mary Simon, from an Indigenous background, was a first in that pattern. But we also have to consider the role of the Crown. As someone who is a legal expert, perhaps no one knows better than her how important this is in Canada's constitutional monarchy system. Including the special and direct and living, frankly, relationship between the Crown and Indigenous peoples. This is a role that Louise Arbour, as a judge, sort of presided over arguments in the past, will now be embodying the role of the Crown here in Canada. When our elected democracy runs smoothly, yes, this is a very ceremonial role. But if a Governor General did need to intervene, this is an office that must be seen as trusted, upholding the nation's best interests, using wise judgment. I think we all expect that we're in a world where we could see sovereignty referendums, and not just one, but two provinces. Someone speaking with clarity on national unity, someone who can rise above partisan politics in this moment. She will need to explain her family's direct engagement in partisan politics and how she intends to manage those relationships. But you know, conflicts of interest, everyone brings them to a role, and it is, you know, sometimes the art of managing those in terms of maintaining credibility and trust with people, and we will be listening for those sorts of messages today. Finally, her approach to the job, right? You have to have the energy and enthusiasm to get out there and engage with Canadians in their best, but also their worst moments, as well as represented on the world stage in sort of a very nuanced diplomatic role where you need to complement the government of the day but not contradict it. So it'll be interesting to hear from both her and Mark Carney about what their intentions are in that regard.
Now, as we continue to talk about this, the selection process, of course, a lot was weighed into this because there have been controversial selections before. Let's talk about what's involved in that process of picking the next Governor General. And of course, one would think back to the last time that, in fact, the Prime Minister had an audience with the King as well.
Yeah, an important moment perhaps in retrospect now that we know sort of that this announcement has come out. March 16th was the day that Mark Carney last had an audience with King Charles. They don't tell us what's said. These are confidential meetings, but was it his opportunity to discuss his recommendation to represent the sovereign in Canada in confidence at that time? The former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, had an advisory board on a vice-regal appointment like this. The current Prime Minister's office has not said what process he used to come up with today's pick. We were expecting Mary Simon's tenure to come to an end. She's been there for 5 years. That's about an average tenure. Her spouse, Whit Fraser, had been speaking publicly about their life beyond Rideau Hall. So this isn't a surprise in that sense. But we will see once this news conference gets underway whether we learn not just the pick, but the path to arrive at this pick from the Prime Minister.
Janice, thank you for this. That is the CBC's Janice McGregor in Ottawa. So as we continue our special coverage of the Prime Minister announcing the new Governor General, we also want to reflect on the current Governor General, Mary Simon. She made history as the first Indigenous person to fill the role. So for more on her work during her term in office, we've reached Nigan Sinclair in Winnipeg. He's a columnist at the Winnipeg Free Press and a regular contributor to CBC's Power and Politics. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bonjour. Thanks for having me.
Now, of course, we do want to talk about Mary Simon, but right before I get to that, of course, we had the breaking news this morning confirming that, in fact, Louise Arbour will be named as the next Governor General. I wanted to get your initial reaction to that.
Well, Louise Arbour is a good pick in lots of different ways, has led investigations into sexual harassment within Canadian Armed Services, has done incredible work internationally looking into atrocities in places like Rwanda, and of course is a Francophone. And much of the concern with some of Governor General Mary Simon, of course, was that she wasn't able to speak in those two official languages. But let's not forget that she is a fluent Inuktitut speaker, and we might want to think about other languages as equally important who have been here certainly longer than French and English. And so it's a good choice. And I think, these are a very ceremonial role. This isn't a big, substantial political move by the federal government, but it is something in which they're trying to look at inclusion. And I think including Francophone in that office is a good move.
So now let's take a moment to also look at the tenure of Governor General Mary Simon as well. It was significant that she was the first Indigenous woman to hold this role. When we look back at her tenure and her focus on reconciliation as well, what stands out to you?
Governor General Mary Simon was one of the most successful Indigenous advocates, not just nationally, but internationally. She advocated for Inuit rights globally at the United Nations and the Circumpolar Conference. And Mary Simon was not just, or still is, a amazing person who has thought very deeply about the efforts of reconciliation between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. And of course, she also brings a sensibility of community, of family, and amongst our people, Indigenous peoples, tremendous amount of gravitas, a lot of different ways. We're seeing her as a very staunch grandmother who brought a sensibility to the role, which wasn't just to advocate for Indigenous peoples, but was to bring Indigenous peoples and Canadians into that office in ways that had never been done before. These are, I think only back to Adrienne Clarkson as someone who understood certainly the issues of newcomers to Canada. Mary Simon brought very much the idea of Canadians, both past and present and in the future, into all of that office together. And so she's been one of the better Governor Generals that certainly I've seen in my lifetime, and probably that we've ever had.
I know that you have had an opportunity, as you touched on, to meet with her several times as well. How do you feel that she may be viewing this next step now as exiting this particular role, and about the incoming Louise Arbour?
Well, this is where those of us in media have to disclose a few things here and there, and one of the things is Mary Simon. Upon becoming friends with her, she knew my father. She also acted as a big support for my daughter, who is in Ottawa and going to school there. So Mary Simon is a person who is just a kind, generous person who thinks very deeply about young people, about young Indigenous peoples, but also making sure that everybody is considered and cared for. I think that what her legacy will be is her legacy will be about both standing up for Indigenous peoples in her career and bringing that to that office, but helping lead the most progressive government in Canadian history. We have never had a Canadian government until the government of Justin Trudeau, that cared about Indigenous peoples. There really was never a prime minister or a cabinet, or certainly a government that passed any legislation, acknowledged harm. And Governor General Mary Simon is very much at the center of that, helping nudge the government forward and encourage it, and also do very important symbolic gestures. I think about the times that she showed up during the many National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which also happened during her time in office. This is a Governor General in which we are going to remember. She will be an important one that will be thought about as much as this office isn't a very political office. This was a moment in which she did the best that she could to be able to navigate what was a ceremonial role, but bring it into the national conversation.
You know, finally, Nigan, I wanted to ask you, in terms of what Louise Arbour can bring to this role that you mentioned when it comes to Mary Simon, that is, of course, reconciliation. There had been criticisms, which you've touched on, about her not being fluent in French. Certainly, we know that it appears the next pick, is fluent in both English and French, very much so. I'm wondering whether or not you feel there will be that equal focus on reconciliation with the new Governor General.
Well, for anyone who wants to criticize Mary Simon not being able to speak two colonial languages, I want to point out that she worked very hard to learn during her time in office. And I would encourage any Governor General, and Louise Arbour in particular, to learn an Indigenous language, because that is the first language of this place. And most importantly, while Canadian law, most of it, except for areas like Nunavut, may not recognize Indigenous languages, I hope that the Governor General moves towards understanding that that office has moved in directions that have never moved before. And yes, of course, I think Louise Arbour will bring that international sensibility, that very much post-Confederation sensibility. What my hope is that Louise Arbour understands that there is a real critical space. You cannot get dams done, you cannot get highways done, you cannot get any projects of the so-called national interest done. Never mind the fact that we as a society have chronically under-supported, marginalized, harmed Indigenous peoples, and that is becoming very expensive, very inefficient, and also becoming a big problem for all of us and everywhere from coast to coast to coast. So we have to see each other, and for this country to come together, that's what that office is supposed to be all about. The Governor General is supposed to be for everybody, and I hope that for Indigenous peoples, this will not be a step backwards.
Nigan, I want to thank you so much for your time today and for this conversation. I appreciate it.
Yeah, Miigwech, thanks so much.
Nigan Sinclair is a columnist at the Winnipeg Free Press and a regular contributor to CBC's Power and Politics. We reached him today in Winnipeg. Thanks again. So a reminder for our viewers, we are expecting the Prime Minister's formal announcement to take place in just a few minutes' time. You can see on your screen there that we are awaiting for the arrival of the Prime Minister at the National Gallery. The announcement rather, is set to take place at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. CBC News has confirmed that Louise Arbour will be the next Governor General of Canada. So let's now turn to the CBC's Catherine Cullen, the host of The House on CBC Radio. She joins us now live from Ottawa. Okay, so first, let's talk about the name that, of course, we know now, the former Supreme Court of Canada Justice who will take on this nonpartisan role. What do we know about her?
Well, Arthi, I think it's interesting because this is certainly an accomplished Canadian. No one would question that. Her time with the Supreme Court of Canada, chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunals of both the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. She has done work with the United Nations. There are schools named after her across this country, including one here in Ottawa. She took on military misconduct. She was part of a review committee there. So somebody who's an incredibly accomplished legal mind who has contributed to many conversations in this country as well as abroad seeking justice. I think she is an interesting choice because she points to a couple of issues that Mark Carney must be thinking about here. One is the question of trying to avoid particular problems. The other, the message that he hopes to send. When it comes to avoiding problems, there is that question of her being a Francophone, originally from Montreal, a Quebecer. Nigan Sinclair just talked about the significance of having a Governor General who spoke Inuktitut as well as English. Nonetheless, there was considerable criticism. Hundreds of complaints received here in Ottawa, I believe, by the Official Languages Commissioner about her inability to speak French. Yes, she spent hours upon hours trying to learn French, but the perception certainly in a lot of the media coverage was that she was ultimately not successful. She struggled to carry on a conversation. And the new Official Languages Commissioner has said that she thinks it's very important that the person who holds this office be fluently bilingual. Obviously, with Madame Arbour, that will in no way be a concern. I think the fact that she is a woman as well is relevant. There have been some questions about Mark Carney being surrounded by a lot of men, not entirely men certainly, but a lot of people sort of around the center of power being male. Questions about some of the things that he has said in the past about feminist foreign policy, that no longer being the objective. So I think putting a woman in that role, also perhaps a way that he is tacitly speaking to any potential concerns around his feminism or equality.
You know, when we talk about some of those key criteria, for example, the fluency in both of Canada's official languages, to your point regarding gender parity, we had known that yesterday as well. It had been confirmed to CBC that the next pick would be a woman as well. I want to also ask you a little bit about the controversies that have come into play with this role, and that's specifically when we're talking about Julie Payette. And it never had been a controversial role prior to that. I wonder how much more care in weighing in and vetting the person who takes on this role has started to take place, because we know that Justin Trudeau essentially brought back this advisory committee as well to help in that selection. So how much do you think of the vetting was taking place because of what we saw happen prior to 2021?
I mean, you gotta hope, Arthi. Like, my goodness, I was looking at some of the coverage, excellent coverage by our colleagues Ashley Burke and Kristen Everson of what happened with Julie Payette, right? These not just allegations. There was an internal report that looked into this and found that Rideau Hall was a toxic workplace when she was in charge. And there are now, in hindsight, indicators that that is something that Justin Trudeau's PMO should have been wise to, the potential for problematic behavior if they had looked closer at Julie Payette. Obviously, though, Madame Payette was a very well-regarded Canadian at the time. They liked the story that it told. In this case, Louise Arbour also has a very long public history. One assumes, one hopes that there has been considerable vetting, but I think it's one of the questions we would expect that would be asked today is how the Prime Minister came to this particular conclusion. He's somebody who certainly takes institutions very seriously and seems to hold their monarchy in quite a bit of esteem. You'll recall the King coming for the first speech from the throne. So I think we're going to learn, we hope, a little bit more about the process and the thought that went into this particular selection.
And finally, I wanted to ask you, Catherine, as we continue to wait for the announcement, the official announcement at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time, how you believe that Louise Arbour may differ from Mary Simon in terms of focus and scope. We were discussing with Nigan Sinclair, of course, the significance of Mary Simon being the first Indigenous person to hold that role.
Madame Arbour, I mean, each Governor General brings their own set of preoccupations and concerns to the role. Some of the things when we look at her biography that make her interesting, I think, this is somebody who deeply understands some of the institutions of this country, obviously the judicial system, Supreme Court, provincial courts, the military as well, with her work on military misconduct. She is also somebody who has played important roles internationally with the International Criminal Tribunal, her work with the United Nations, special representative having to do with migration. So she will have thought both about the institutions of this country and sort of the broader global picture. And it is one of the roles of Governor General, not necessarily one that Canadians think about a lot, but you are, of course, a representative of this country as the head of state, as the monarch's representative in this country. It is, we all know, a very unsettled, interesting political moment. We have the questions about Canada's sovereignty. We don't talk about them as much anymore, but through some of the comments that Donald Trump has made, Canada's position in the world, our sense of ourselves as a country has been part of the political conversation. And then there is the very domestic concerns about the prospect of perhaps a referendum on sovereignty in Alberta, perhaps a referendum on sovereignty from Quebec, depending on the outcome of the provincial election there in the fall. So the extent to which Madame Arbour will engage with this conversation that is only going to pick up steam about national unity and about national identity. The Governor General, I mean, let's be honest, it's not a role that Canadians are sitting around talking about a lot in Tim Hortons. So it is to each Governor General to decide how to make the office relevant while maintaining that sort of political neutrality. I'm very interested to see where she might hope to take the conversation, how she will in some ways take the torch that will have been passed to her from Mary Simon. Mindfulness of questions around reconciliation, for instance. Is that an issue on which she hopes to engage? What kind of conversation does she want to have with Canadians? Are Canadians interested in this conversation? And then, you know, above all, avoiding controversy in order to ensure that there is trust in this institution, given that it is a fundamental one, and this is a time that Canadians are thinking about what makes our country, unique, certainly compared to our neighbors to the south, but in the world, in this time of fluctuation and change, this role has the potential to be an important one.
Catherine, thank you so much for this. That is the CBC's Catherine Cullen. She's the host of The House on CBC Radio. She joined us today from Ottawa. And a reminder, of course, we've got our eyes on the National Gallery. We are expecting to see the Prime Minister and the new incoming Governor General as they will walk down this hallway, as you can see, flanked by Canadian flags to make the official announcement that Louise Arbour, which has been confirmed by sources to Radio Canada, will be Canada's next Governor General. That announcement again coming up at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. As we wait for that, let's dig a little bit deeper into the duties that Louise Arbour will take on in the role of Governor General. For that, I've got CBC's Marianne Demain here in studio. You know, as we were just discussing with Catherine, many people may not be privy to what exactly the role of the Governor General is. So break it down for us.
Yeah, Catherine says they're not necessarily sitting around at Tim Hortons discussing this today. So to remind Canadians, the Governor General is the representative of the King of Canada and also serves as the Commander-in-Chief of Canada. They typically serve an average about 5 years after they are appointed by the King on the advice of the Prime Minister. And there is a long list of constitutional duties and responsibilities that are in place once the new Governor General is in this new role. And that includes ensuring that Canada has a government in place, a Prime Minister in place. They swear in the Prime Minister, as well as Cabinet Minister and the Chief Justice of Canada. They also deliver the speech from the throne. In addition to that, they grant royal assent to acts of Parliament and appoint members of the Privy Council, Lieutenant Governor, and some judges. In addition to representing Canada, they do that on the home front as well, but also abroad. And part of that is also recognizing the role and the importance of the Canadian military.
And now also there's some of the really unifying forces in this country too. How is that?
It's really important that they keep Canada united, keep Canada's values front and center, respect, security, peace, diversity. And that's something we saw Governor General Mary Simon do when she was visiting Tumbler Ridge earlier this year in the wake of the fatal shooting there. She was there paying her respects to the community, and that really is a key part of the job, visiting Canadians in their specific communities right across the country, also engaging with Indigenous communities, recognizing their involvement. Of course, reconciliation, also very important. The Governor General also has a role in giving out awards and honors. That includes the Order of Canada.
Marianne, thank you for this. That is the CBC's Marianne Demain. Now, as we've been reporting, Louise Arbour has a long, distinguished resume. She is expected to be announced and confirmed by the Prime Minister as the new Governor General. That announcement at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Earlier today, CBC News spoke with Ed Wang. He's a royal commentator in Vancouver who spent some time working with Arbour.
I think Madame Arbour is an excellent choice. Having known her personally, we actually worked together at the same law firm up until 2025 when I moved firms. And I've gotten to know her through her tenure at our previous law firm, but also when she was a Supreme Court Justice, as well as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and Chief Prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal set up for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. She is a very capable lady, an accomplished jurist with strong legal acumen and a strong legal mind. And I think she will be excellent for the role of the Governor General, especially in a time where national unity has been questioned. She is fluent in both English and French. She is a Quebecer, but she also worked professionally in Ontario. She came up through the court systems in Ontario in what was then the Ontario High Court, now the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, and the Ontario Court of Appeal, prior to being appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada by Jean Chrétien. So in a time where we needed someone to portray all aspects of Canada who can speak English and French fluently, I think this was an excellent choice. Well, I think Madame Arbour had a lot of practice already. And she's an accomplished person. But her list of accomplishments are in roles that have very similarities to the requirements of the Governor General compared to some of the accomplishments of some of her predecessors, such as Julie Payette. And so, as Supreme Court of Canada Justice, she would have had to remain impartial. She would have had to be very guarded in her opinions and her thoughts, and she would have already carried out some of the day-to-day duties of the Governor General. Now, the Supreme Court of Canada Chief Justice and all the other justices have an appointment as deputy to the Governor General. And so for 5 years on the Supreme Court, she would have had to been called on to act as a deputy to the Governor General in doing things such as providing royal assent when the Governor General of the day was not there. And so she would have had some practice in some of the day-to-day administrative roles. And in her capacity as a prosecutor, in her capacity of the Supreme Court of Canada Justice, she would have had some training in being in the outward appearances of being impartial.
Ed Wang is a royal commentator in Vancouver. Thank you. So once again, we are expecting the Prime Minister's formal announcement to take place in just a few minutes from now. For more, let's again turn to the CBC's Catherine Cullen. She's host of The House on CBC Radio, and she joins us now from Ottawa. Hey, Catherine. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more, too, about the significance of this appointment. You know, we touched on it in our earlier conversation, and even though it is somewhat a ceremonial role, any appointment made by the Prime Minister is of significance.
And this is certainly the most high-profile appointment that he has made in his year now, plus as Prime Minister of Canada. I think, you know, it's difficult not to contrast Mark Carney's pick with the previous choices of both Mary Simon and Julie Payette. In those cases, Justin Trudeau really liked to send a message to Canadians, right? Madame Payette, we were talking about it a few minutes ago, Arthi, you know, the fact that she was an astronaut and represented this sort of Canadian aspiration. Certainly that was the hope, of course, overshadowed by some of the considerable controversy that led to her resignation from the role. But there was an attempt to do a bit of inspiring Canadians with that particular choice. With Governor General Simon, the first Indigenous person appointed to this role, reconciliation was certainly a priority for Justin Trudeau. And so, again, there was a message that was being sent. So very interested to see how the Prime Minister talks about his choice of Madame Arbour today, because, of course, he's a very different communicator, doesn't necessarily talk about things in the same kinds of terms. But I would say, you know, the fact that she is an expert in governance, in institutions, and that is something that Mark Carney thinks very much about. You know, the Canada in the world, the functioning of Canadian institutions. I'm interested to see the extent to which he is going to draw on that, and frankly, just what his relationship with this new Governor General will be like. She brings quite a considerable amount of expertise. Now, Governor General Simon, a diplomat herself who had held several high-profile roles, but Madame Arbour's CV is, you know, it takes a while to get through it, as you were just hearing from the previous guest. The extent to which he might choose to, you know, seek her counsel on particular issues, I think that remains to be seen. Mark Carney is certainly a man who keeps his own counsel and a very decisive individual, but he does have great esteem, as we were saying a few moments ago, for the monarchy. The decision to bring the King to Canada, to ask the King to come to Canada to deliver the first speech from the throne. You know, he's had several meetings with the King, and it's clear he holds the institution of the monarchy in quite a lot of regard. And so listening to him talk a little bit more about this role, part of what makes Canada certainly different from the United States, I think it will be interesting to see how he talks about his choice and what relationship he expects to have with this new Governor General.
And certainly we know that the Prime Minister had an audience with the King back in March, and perhaps this is one of the conversations that they had behind closed doors. You know, we talk about the impressive resume, Catherine, and of course, in addition to serving as the judge of the Supreme Court of Justice, acted as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, as the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda as well. So certainly no shortage of accomplishments there. But I wanted to ask you politically, and we touched on this a little bit, about what it means to pivot to someone who is from Quebec, who is fluent, particularly because that was a big question when Prime Minister Mark Carney was also campaigning for his current role as Prime Minister. And there was heavy criticism with Governor General Mary Simon as well for not being fluent in French.
Well, Mark Carney's relationship with the province of Quebec is certainly a fascinating one because he enjoys a really significant level of popularity in Quebec. But it has to be said, I mean, his French is certainly, I mean, My French is not without flaws either, but then again, I'm not the Prime Minister of Canada, Arthi. But sometimes it is labored. His French is certainly imperfect, and there have been some missteps. We think back to that cabinet retreat in Quebec City, where he gave a speech about Canada. He talked about the Plains of Abraham and that being a moment of sort of conciliation in this country. A misstep. Many viewed it as a misreading of history, and perhaps a bit of an awkward moment that raised questions about how he perceived an important part of Canadian history. Now, with the prospect of a Quebec referendum in the fall, that would depend on whether the Parti Québécois wins the Quebec election, which at one point seemed like it was perhaps not a sure thing. There are a few sure things in politics, but a likely outcome. Now, the political picture in Quebec is more complicated. But if the Parti Québécois win, they've made it clear that they would want to hold a referendum vote on the sovereignty of Quebec. Her insights into that institution and just Mark Carney's ties with Quebec will be significant. We have to consider, though, there's also the question of Alberta right now and the prospect of a sovereignty referendum. We saw signatures handed over in that province yesterday to speak to the possibility of a referendum there. So inevitably, I said there are a few sure things in politics. I think we can safely say that the conversation around national unity in this country is going to heat up once again in a particular way over the course of the next few months, and in a different way than it ever has before, with the prospect of the sort of pulling polls of these two potential referendums at once. And I think we can see there, Arthi, emerging from behind the flags, Mark Carney and his choice for Governor General. Yes.
We've got our eyes, for our viewers who may just be joining us right now, we've got our eyes on the National Gallery in Ottawa. You are looking at Prime Minister Mark Carney walking through the National Gallery alongside Louise Arbour, who has been confirmed by CBC Radio Canada to be the incoming Governor General. That announcement set to take place in just a matter of minutes right now. Yes, Catherine, please.
I was just going to say, Arthi, because I'm based in Ottawa and I've spent some time at the National Gallery, it's one of my favorite places in the city. The actual design is that you are coming up a ramp as you enter that main space, and I believe the architect's intention was it is supposed to be a sort of an ascent. You clear your mind, you can see Parliament, you look out over the city as you get ready to take in these works of art. Well, now, perhaps a clearing of the mind as they prepare for an important political moment here, and certainly for Louise Arbour, an interesting new addition to that very considerable CV.
That's some important context as we take a look at the scene here and, of course, where all of this is happening. We know that the previous Governor General, Mary Simon, held that role since July 2021. The Prime Minister is up at the microphone.
Morning,
let's listen in.
Bonjour tout le monde. Nous sommes réunis ici sur le territoire traditionnel
on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. And that recognition of this territory shows the common history of the people of this country. We wanted to pursue truth and reconciliation together through our actions as well as through our words.
We're gathering this morning at the National Gallery of Canada. A few blocks away from here, at the then Clarendon Hotel, 146 years ago, the first exhibition was held of the Canadian Academy of the Arts. That academy was the dream of the then Governor General, the Marquess of Lorne, and his wife, Her Royal Highness Princess Louise. They believed that a young confederation needed institutions through which it could see itself and through which it could be seen by the world. 388 works hung in the Clarendon that evening, and those works would become the seeds of this gallery, which today holds more than 17,000 works of Canadian, Indigenous, and global art. Canada was built on the foundations of three peoples: Indigenous, French, and British. Indigenous peoples mapped this continent, sustained its lands and waters, and built trading networks from coast to coast to coast for thousands of years before any European arrival. The French built a society shaped by river and forest, by partnership with Indigenous nations, and by a determination to flourish in a new world. When the British came, that civilization did not disappear. It suffered, but endured, and in time it grew into the federation that we know today. Let's be clear. That founding was imperfect. It excluded too many. It was built in part on the dispossession and broken promises to Indigenous peoples. But that founding contained an insight that has carried us forward. That unity does not require uniformity. That our differences are a strength to be nurtured, not a risk to be managed. That insight has been sustained and then reinforced, generation after generation, by our institutions, Parliament, the courts, the Crown, the treaties, the Charter, the public service, a free press.
Thanks to these institutions, as such a vast and diversified country as ours, we have managed not only to remain united, but to prosper. In a less civilized and more dangerous world, those institutions are now more important than ever.
A year ago, His Majesty King Charles opened our Parliament with a speech from the throne, the first time in nearly 70 years that Canada's sovereign had done so in person. The Crown is a continuous thread through our constitutional life. It is, as His Majesty himself said, a symbol of Canada in all her richness and dynamism. And the Governor-General is the Crown's representative in Canada, Commander-in-Chief of the Canadian Armed Forces, steward of our traditions of peace, order, and good government. And above all, the Governor-General is the guardian of our constitutional order. The most demanding part of that role is rarely seen. It's the duty to ensure that government in Canada is formed, sustained, and, when the time comes, dismissed in accordance with law and convention. It's a duty that calls for sound judgment, deep learning, and an unwavering commitment to the rule of law. That is the office. And it is the office to which I have asked His Majesty to appoint a Canadian whose entire life has been dedicated to that very principle. I'm very pleased to announce that on my recommendation, His Majesty has approved the appointment of the Honourable Louise Arbour as the 31st Governor-General of Canada. Née à Montréal, Louise
Born in
Arbour
Montreal,
a fait ses
Louise
études à
Arbour
l'Université de Montréal.
studied at the University of Montreal. She was admitted to the Quebec Bar in 1971 and in the Ontario Bar in 1977. She began her career as a researcher at Osgood Hall and as a fervent defender of civil liberties in this country.
Louise Arbour was appointed to the Supreme Court of Ontario, as it was then known. In 1990, she was appointed to the Court of Appeal for Ontario. In 1999, she was appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada. One of Canada's most demanding judicial careers, more than enough for one lifetime. That career would serve only as the foundation for what came next, because her most consequential work as a jurist was beyond the Canadian courtroom. In 1996, Louise Arbour was appointed by the United Nations Security Council as Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda, the first international criminal tribunals since Nuremberg. She inherited two institutions that many believed could not succeed. She made them succeed. Under her leadership, the tribunal secured the first conviction for genocide since the adoption of the Genocide Convention in 1948. The Akayesu judgment, which also established for the first time that sexual violence can constitute a weapon of genocide and a crime against humanity. And in 1999, in the middle of a war, she signed the indictment of a sitting head of state, Slobodan Milosevic, for crimes against humanity and violations of the laws of war, something that had never been done before. A new precedent
for justice and a lack of favoritism. This is not about technical prowess. Her achievements are the foundation of a modern state and a modern system where no one, whoever that person may be, however well protected he may be, is beyond the reach of the law.
Is the foundation of Canadian citizenship. We're a country whose civic identity is grounded in the universality of rights, that what is owed to one of us is owed to all of us. And what is owed to a Canadian is owed, in our tradition, to every human being, whether or not they have the great good fortune to live here. In 2004, Louise Arbour left the Supreme Court of Canada to become United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. For 4 years, she gave voice to those whose dignity was denied, in places where the powerful preferred silence. She did not flinch, and she never confused being heard with being safe. Il existe une troisième fil conducteur dans la carrière
There is another part of Ms. Arbour's career, and this one is not as often mentioned, but just as important. 3 times, Louise was asked to look at an institution that had not met its obligations to the people it was responsible for, and to find the necessary measures to remedy the situation. In 1995, Ms. Arbour presided over the inquiry with respect to the women's prison, and her work made it possible to modernize practices affecting women in Canada. As Commissioner, she asked the system to show itself worthy of the respect of the people it chose to serve. In 2022, when she had finished her study, she drafted and filed a report on issues in the Canadian Armed Forces. Her recommendations are currently being implemented, and they will redefine Canadian military justice.
Her work matters in and of itself. It also tells us something about what Louise Arbour will bring to Rideau Hall. The conviction that institutions are the load-bearing walls of a civil society, and that they remain trustworthy only as long as someone is willing to hold them accountable. Louise Arbour has held nearly every office a Canadian jurist can hold, and several that no Canadian has held before. She has been recognized with nearly 100 honors and awards, including 42 honorary doctorates from universities around the world. She's a companion of the Order of Canada, our country's highest civilian honor. But the measure of her career is neither in the offices she has held nor the awards she's received. It's in the lives she has changed through her service. Survivors of genocide who saw justice in their lifetimes. Women in prisons in Canada whose conditions were improved because she said what no one else would say. Members of our armed forces who can serve today with greater dignity because of the report that she wrote.
Millions of persons whose rights are now better protected because somewhere an institution that Louise Arbour contributed to build profited from her work. Millions of people who have benefited from the norms that she established. That is the service. A service based on principles.
Across more than 5 decades in every role she's held, the Honourable Louise Arbour has carried the same conviction, that a free society depends on institutions properly being held to account. that the law stands between power and the powerless, that the dignity of every person should not be a product of the accidents of geography, citizenship, or convenience, and that Canada's place in the world is to be a country that lives those propositions and helps others to live them as well. A deeply Canadian conviction, one that's older than our charter and broader than our borders. It runs through our public life, from the person's case to the patriation of our Constitution, from the building of Medicare to the building of the United Nations. C'est la conviction qu'une communauté
It's the
est plus que
conviction
la
that a
somme de ses
community
membres.
is more
Ce sont les
than
institutions, les
the
traditions,
parts.
les engagements à travers lesquels nous
And
choisissons de vivre ensemble.
It is through this commitment that we can live together.
Louise Arbour a consacré sa vie à
This is something to
défendre
which
et à
Louise
définir.
Arbour
C'est ce
devoted
qu'elle
her life.
apportera à la fonction
And
qu'elle s'apprête à assumer.
this will be invaluable as she fulfills the
before I
duties she is
conclude,
about to undertake.
We observe that Madame Arbour will succeed an exemplary Governor General. Her Excellency, the Right Honourable Mary Simon, has been a steadfast representative of Canada and our institutions at home and around the world. As the first Indigenous person to serve in this role, she's carried forward a lifetime of advocacy for Inuit rights, for Indigenous self-determination, and for the preservation of our Indigenous languages, cultures, and identities. Elle nous a rappelé que la
She
réconciliation
reminded
est une
us
responsabilité
that
à vivre
reconciliation
chaque jour.
is a responsibility to be experienced every day.
De plus. Madame Simon
Also,
s'est fait
Ms.
la
Simon
championne de
was
l'alphabétisation et de
a
l'éducation.
champion of literacy and education, which she considers to be the foundation of our determination. Her leadership also contributed to highlight the mental health issues within Northern and Indigenous communities. She was able to highlight the problems that are too often neglected and therefore gave a voice to so many people who are suffering and who are too often ignored. Her legacy will endure, not only thanks to her service to the nation, but also thanks to the way she fulfilled her mission with elegance, with determination, and with a full commitment to this country.
General Simon, to His Excellency Whit Fraser, to your family, thank you for your extraordinary service to Canada. At a time when much of the world is buffeted by crises and the worst are full of passionate intensity, Canada's history, our institutions, and our enduring traditions matter more than ever. We retain our convictions. We reinforce our institutions. As Mary Simon has, Louise Arbour will represent the best of Canada to Canadians and to the world. A country that's a bastion of security, prosperity, and justice, a beacon to a world lost at sea. A Canada that is clear-eyed about the challenges we face and steadfast in the values we uphold. A Canada that's not just strong, but good. A Canada that's not just prosperous, but fair. A Canada that is not just for some most of the time, but for all of the time. Madame Arbour, au nom du gouvernement du Canada,
Ms. Arbour, on behalf of the Government of Canada and all the people of Canada, thank you for agreeing to serve our country once again.
It's my pleasure to introduce the 31st Governor General of Canada, the Honourable Louise Arbour. Madame.
Bonjour à tous et à toutes.
Hello, everyone. And Prime Minister, let me begin by thanking you for that very wonderful presentation, but also for your confidence in me. I want to express my gratitude to the Sovereign for this opportunity to serve Canada in this role. I also want to point out the extraordinary role played by Mary Simon Simon, who served our country with tireless devotion. She represented all Canadians with dignity and compassion.
Canada is a wonderful country, shaped by its diversity of people, of perspectives and experiences, but I think shaped also mostly by a common respect for strong public institutions and for the rule of law. Above all, we all strive to provide for each other in a spirit of equality and generosity. I'm very mindful of the legacy that I'm stepping into. J'accepte ces responsabilités avec un sens
this
profond du
responsibility
devoir.
with a deep sense of duty at a time when Canadians are confronted with complexity and change. Aware of this reality, I think we must develop the necessary tools to meet those challenges and reaffirm our confidence in each other. The strength of this country resides in stable institutions managed with wisdom and sustained through the desire for the well-being of our country and all the planet. This will be a great honor for me to represent Canada and to celebrate our successes. It will also be a privilege to be present if we end up facing adversity. And I'm fully confident in the ability to serve as Chief of the Canadian Armed Forces. I have a great deal of respect for the service and professionalism of the men and women who serve, and it will be a huge honor for me to serve in that role.
I will strive to serve with honor, dedication, and integrity. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, on est prêt, nous deux.
So we are both ready to answer your questions.
Good morning, Madame Arbour. Prime Minister Ashley Burke, CBC News. There's an expense program for former governors generals that allows them to claim up more than $200,000 a year, and that's on top of their expenses. And the reimbursements last year totaled more than $550,000. A Privy Council report in 2019 said there wasn't enough transparency around this, that Canadians should know exactly how that money is being spent and by who, and it called for more transparent public reporting. Do you think this program should continue? And if so, will you commit to ensuring that there is more, the details about how this money is spent and by who will be made public?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I'm not familiar with the details that you're quoting. I'll look into it, ensure that, as you say, that there's adequate transparency around the expenses. I'll just observe that the Governor Generals have served our country with distinction. And in the cases in their post time after being Governor General, continue to serve Canadians through their charitable and other foundation activities, for which I'm personally grateful, and I think all Canadians are as well. Thank you.
Do you think that the details of that should be public? And to both of you, what is the Governor General's role right now, do you think, in promoting national unity at a time when it looks like there could be a referendum on separation in Alberta, and as well a party that wants one in Quebec could return to power?
So I'll begin. I think I answered the first part of your second question. I will follow up with you. With everybody, transparently. In terms of the Governor General represents all Canadians, and I think very importantly represents what's at the heart of our institutions and the spirit of Canada, that we're all equal. The rule of law applies to everyone, the powerful as well as the powerless, that we believe in democracy and the processes. So with respect to the many great strengths of this country, they're as appreciated in my home province of Alberta as they are appreciated across the territories where I was born and across this great land. And the Governor General's role is institutional in the sense of very clear constitutional responsibilities that are called into need from time to time, but also to represent Canada at home, best of Canada to Canadians and abroad.
Next question. I can only echo First, the constitutional role of the Governor General, which I think is a very important part of the function. But beyond that, I think there is a space for the Governor General to be conducive of Canadian dialogue with respect to diverse. I've mentioned the diversity of our people, diversity of views, of opinions, of experiences, but all that, I think, in a spirit of respect and moving the country forward in an ambitious, united way.
Next question, Laurence.
Oui, bonjour, Laurence Martin de Radio-Canada.
Laurence Martin, I have a question for both of you. You are francophone. Your predecessor did not speak French. Do you believe that was a mistake by Mr. Trudeau to appoint someone who was bilingual but did not speak French? I'll begin. I think it is a good choice now to have Ms. Arbour as our 31st Governor General of Canada. Yes, it is important that there be bilingualism within all the federal government's institutions. Was it a mistake by Mr. Trudeau? Ms. Simon, as I just said, I began to explain the many contributions made by Ms. Simon to this country, which are very important when it comes to reconciliation, mental health, and representing Canada right around the world. We will build on the foundations of the last 30 Governors General. Ms. Arbour, I already mentioned that, first of all, I have a great deal of respect for all the people who came before me in this role. I have a great deal of respect and a lot of admiration for the work done by Ms. Simon, and I have no opinion on the decisions that were made with respect to the choice that was made previously. Mr. Carney said you represent the British Crown here in Canada. Do you consider yourself to be a monarchist, Ms. Arbour? Well, I don't really know what that term is supposed to mean. I will give you a legal and constitutional answer. I will serve as the representative of the Crown in a constitutional monarchy based on a parliamentary system, in a constitutional arrangement that has very well served Canada, particularly in recent years, and I'm quite convinced that this will continue to be the case.
I forget the question.
Can someone repeat the question in English, please?
Yes. Yeah, am I a monarchy? Well, I started by saying that this term is unfortunately very often used in a pejorative way. What I can say is that I will accede to a function in which I will be the representative of the Crown in a constitutional arrangement that I think has served Canada extremely well throughout our history, but even more in recent decades. I think a system that will continue to provide continuity in our institutions and our form of governance.
Next question, prochaine question. Risa?
Good morning, Raisa Patel, the Toronto Star. Prime Minister, you said in your recent trip to Armenia that it's your strong personal view that as the international order will be rebuilt, it will be rebuilt out of Europe. What did you mean by that? Do you see a future where Europe overtakes the U.S. as the center of the world order?
Well, I think there's a direct line to what we're celebrating today. I think we are celebrating the constitutional role of the Governor General. And other Canadians are celebrating Madame Arbour's willingness to serve in that role, which is a belief in democracy, the rule of law, that we're all equal before that law. And imperfectly, the international system had variants of that. Madame Arbour's part of her very distinguished career was to make sure that those who transgressed in the most egregious ways those rules, norms, standards were prosecuted and brought to justice. That system, as I've observed in the past, and I'm not alone in making these observations, has been greatly weakened and needs to be rebuilt, and rebuilt perhaps in a different way, but rebuilt based on the same principles. And Canada, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Australia, other countries share very firm convictions with those principles, and we will work together to rebuild. And obviously there's a critical mass in Europe of countries, 27 members of the European Union, but then a broader grouping that you saw in that meeting in Armenia, over 50 countries that have some form of association with Europe and either fully support or are moving towards those principles. So that's what I meant by those comments, and I stand by them.
Follow-up.
Alberta separatists say they have more than 300,000 signatures to potentially trigger a referendum vote. What will you do to stop that referendum from winning?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is there's, again, keeping with the discussion today, there's the rule of law, there's the Clarity Act, which has been opined upon by the Supreme Court. Not at the same time when Madame Arbour was sitting on the Supreme Court, but has been the judgment passed there, and any referenda in any part of Canada need to be consistent with that. As you know as well, there's a judicial, you may know, there's a judicial challenge separately but relatedly by Indigenous nations in Alberta regarding the question. So those processes have to be followed through, but. If you bring it into, so I'm observing that because of the solemnity of the moment that we're observing today and celebrating today, but if you bring it into my day-to-day responsibilities and those of the government, it's to continue to act as we have from the start, which is in the spirit of cooperative federalism, making the country work, making it work for Albertans, making it work for Indigenous peoples, making it work for all Canadians. Thank you.
Next question, prochaine question.
Bonjour, ici Raphaël Pirot du Journal de Québec. Question pour vous deux.
I have a question for both of you. Ms. Arbour, you are someone who is quite frank, and you criticize Donald Trump's government on Radio-Canada, saying that the invasion of Iran was pure folly. And in that regard, I'd like you to talk about how you think the U.S. government will react to your appointment. Do you not fear losing your ability to speak out in this new role? In the past, I have held many offices within the United Nations, and of course as a jurist and justice. And in some periods of my life, I was a citizen who had full freedom of expression, and there are privileges and powers that come with certain duties as well as certain constraints, and I can fully accommodate them. Now, I believe that public personalities also fully understand that environment. You can have expressed opinions in a certain context that are not opinions that you would want to highlight in an official context. So I think people fully understand the difference between private comments and positions that you are taking as part of your office. Mr. Carney, yes, I think that was a perfect answer from Ms. Arbour. So do you think the Trump government will try and fight back against this appointment? Well, I believe that the President observed, to much applause, that the United States is founded on the rule of law, human rights law, and it's the same principle that applies in the Canadian way that we are reinforcing today. So that's my answer.
In English, I think you understood the question. So, you know, as His Majesty King Charles observed just last week when he spoke before Congress to great applause, that the United States is a country founded on the rule of law, the right of individuals, and this is what we are reinforcing, celebrating today. an institution at the core of our constitutional system, with someone whose entire career has been dedicated to those principles, coming into such a responsibility at a crucial time. Thank you.
Prochaine question. Next question.
Hi, good morning. Cameron Ryan with CPAC. My question is to Madame Arbour. You authored a report 4 years ago on sexual assault in the Canadian Armed Forces, and you issued 48 recommendations stemming from your investigation. In the 4 years since then, have you seen any progress in how the military treats sexual assault cases and the culture in the forces you called out in that report? You're now the Commander-in-Chief of the Canadian Armed Forces. Will that be an issue that will be a priority for you as Governor General?
I have to say I haven't followed developments, and I wasn't in a position as a citizen to follow the developments with the same level of scrutiny than I did when I issued that report. The report speaks for itself. As to whether there have been initiatives, both formal and informal, this is out in the public domain. I don't have particular insight.
Si je vous permettez, just to add, 47 of the 48 recommendations of Madame Arbour report have been implemented. There is one that is outstanding, which is one of the core, I referred to it obliquely in my remarks, which is the change to military tribunals, military justice, and that is before Parliament in Bill C-11, and it is an absolute priority. It's been from the start, which is why the government introduced it, and we will put it in place. Yeah.
My follow-up is to the Prime Minister. Premier Smith is in town later this week for the Canada Strong and Free conference. Do you have plans to meet with her and discuss the possible upcoming referendum?
That's funny. I thought she was in town to meet me because, yes, there are plans to meet. And if that's good, if she's here, she can take in other activities. But I'm sure the highlight of her visit to the great city of Ottawa will be a side visit to Nepean, my constituency, but also we're having a meeting that's been settled. I can't remember if it's Thursday afternoon or Friday morning, but it's been arranged. I very much look forward to seeing
Will
her.
referendum talk be on the
that
agenda
was
for
your
you?
follow-up.
Next question. Prochaine question.
Yeah.
Oui, bonjour. Hélène Buzetti, les Coop de l'information. Ma première question est pour vous, Madame Arbour.
My first question is for you, Ms. Arbour. You had an extraordinary career. Mr. Carney referred to this. You're known as to be a woman who likes action, who's on the ground. You even shortened your stay in the Supreme Court. Now, I'm wondering what you think you can achieve in a position which involves a lot of handshaking, handing out medals, and so forth. Well, you referred to the happiest part of the office. I thought you were going to ask me how I would be able to deal with more serious duties. I will certainly undertake all those duties with enthusiasm and commitment. People asked me the same question when I agreed to become a Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. After spending 3 years in war zones, for journalists who are here, who work on the ground, you understand the adrenaline that goes along with that job. So I've experienced both, and I can say that not only am I serene, but I'm very enthusiastic at the idea of serving Canada in this new office. And I have pretty much the same question for you, Mr. Carney. You talked about her extraordinary professional profile. What do you see in that profile that will serve the cause of the government? Do you see a specific mission for Ms. Arbour in her new role? Thank you for your question, Ms. Buzetti. That's a very important question, but it's not appropriate for me to talk about a special mission because in the mandate of a Governor General, there are a number of different elements, anticipated as well as unanticipated. And it's important to say that it's important to shake hands and hand out medals. That is an aspect of Canada to celebrate this country. And it's extremely important in my view, that part of the role. You have to be human. Third, there is a constitutional role that's extremely important. From time to time, we observe that role being played during periods of prorogation or during minority governments. It's difficult to anticipate all the possible challenges or constitutional crises that could occur in a mandate. So obviously we have the chance to take advantage of someone especially able to fulfill the role. And I will have an opportunity to have very in-depth conversations with Ms. Arbour in private on issues that affect Canada and the rest of the world. This is a pivotal moment for this country.
David Aiken, Global News. Good afternoon and congratulations, Madame Arbour. I would like to ask, your resume was awfully impressive and the Prime Minister certainly finds it impressive. And yet at times there have been political parties in this country who've taken issue with your work. And I'm going to reference the comment in 2008 of the Treasury Board President at the time, Vic Taves, who after you concluded your work with the UNHCR called you, and I'm quoting from his words in the House of Commons, disgusting. And just yesterday, a senior aide to former Prime Minister Harper, Howard Anglin, also former Chief of Staff to Jason Kenney, tweeted out, anybody but Arbour. So there's a point here is there's conservatives in this country who took issue with you as a, quote, judicial activist and so on, and human rights. And I wondered how you might bridge or seek to make bridges with conservatives who might not be so happy with your appointment. And I think you were probably, Prime Minister, you were probably at the Bank of Canada at the time. I wonder if you'd taken notice of Mr. Taves' comments and what you think about conservatives who didn't seem to have much respect for Ms. Arbour's work at the UNHCR. Madame?
Well, I can tell you that, as I said before, we live in a country where there's a great free space for expression of contrary views, even at times expressed in very robust fashion, and I have immense respect for that process. I will reach out not only to those who agree with me. The kind of cheerleading mode, I think, is not always conducive to change and to progress. I will reach out to anybody who wishes to engage with me, to debate, to discuss. I will listen, and I hope in due course that I will manage to persuade those, particularly those who may doubt my integrity, that I'm not sure I could do much more to try to persuade them otherwise on the basis of what I've done before. But going forward, yeah, I will engage.
Thank you. I'll make three observations. One is, sorry, don't want to shortchange you, David. Right. The first is that I think history has shown that the judgments of the UNHCR at the time, how correct they were, the crimes against humanity and others that were addressed. The first observation. The second is I don't want to extend into a partisan characterization of this. This is an institution that belongs to all Canadians, all political parties, but truly all Canadians. All Canadians today and in the future too, because what we do with the institutions we serve resonates down through the years, and it's part of what I referred to in my remarks in French about the example and how the institutional change that Madame Arbour has brought isn't just about the institution, but the norms and the standards that have changed. And my third observation is that the sun is shining. It's spring. It's a time of hope, confidence, dignity, and a bright future for our country. Thank you.
And perhaps I'll close with a question. This is from Madame Arbour, sort of a big picture. Think about things. You were born in Montreal. Louis Saint-Laurent was the Prime Minister. Queen Elizabeth II was about to appoint the first ever Canadian Governor General, Vincent Massey. You'll be the first Governor General to be appointed by a monarch other than Queen Elizabeth, which is quite remarkable. We've had the Bill of Rights in your lifetime. The Charter has come in your lifetime. I wondered if you, and we're now looking at a Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces who's a Quebecer, and the Chief of Defense Staff is also a Quebec woman. It's quite a series of changes in your lifetime, and I wonder if you'd care to reflect on the change in leadership here in Canada through those years? And if you have some thoughts about, was the Charter a bigger deal than the Bill of Rights? I caution you'll get in trouble with conservatives on that answer, but go ahead.
Well, you know, I'm not going to get into trouble right now because I'm going to give myself, if you'll allow me, the next few weeks before I actually assume my functions to reflect on many of this historical trajectory, where we came from, where we are today. I'm much more interested also in where we're going and what's ahead of us. But please just give me time to reflect on all that. And I hope to have something a little more fully baked for you in the future.
Merci.
Thank you. This puts end to our press conference. C'est ce qui met fin à notre conférence de presse. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. We'll go this way.
There we had the official announcement from Prime Minister Mark Carney at the National Gallery in Ottawa that former Supreme Court Justice Louise Arbour will be Canada's next Governor General. The 79-year-old has served in justice domestically and internationally. Her many accomplishments and impressive resume were highlighted by the Prime Minister. And in her remarks as well, she talked about equality and generosity, that Canadians are being confronted with complexity and change, and that she hopes to watch and help facilitate, develop the tools to rejuvenate our confidence in one another during this time. I want to bring back the CBC's Catherine Cullen, host of The House on CBC Radio. She was listening in along with me. Some really interesting comments there from both the Prime Minister and from the incoming Governor General. I'm wondering, when we listen to those remarks about equality and generosity, her talking about it to be an honor to be present if we face adversity, to be the Commander-in-Chief as well. What did we learn perhaps about the direction that she may take this role?
I was struck by the talk of, it's not the most exciting word, are the institutions, but I really did think in some ways that was the defining through line of all of this. We talked as we were waiting for this announcement to start about, Justin Trudeau had made some choices that were supposed to make big statements. Here, I was struck by the extent to which the Prime Minister and the incoming Governor General both really reflected this talk of Canada's institutions as part of what fortifies this country. The Prime Minister had a line, and I don't know if I have it in front of me, but where he talked about the institutions as basically like being what holds this country up, but the necessity of having someone who will speak truth to power as part of what maintains the integrity of those institutions and our identity over time. It was very much fundamentally a conversation about the underpinnings of this country. Respect for rights was an idea that came up over and over again. So a speech about Canadian identity, Canadian institutions, approaching this moment with solemnity, an appreciation of it as well. It's not exactly like a fist pump rallying cry, but I think it is a reflection of the moment, of the values of the person who is leading this country, that he has chosen someone with a similar view about institutions and rights. And those are also, and it's worth saying, I mean, conversations around rights in this country can become quite partisan, but on a fundamental level, I think if we keep this at a very much a 10,000-foot level, they are things that can unite Canadians. And as we said, this conversation around national unity and our country as it exists in the world is certainly one that has been ongoing and may very well heat up over the course of the coming months with the conversations about sovereignty in both Quebec and Alberta.
Perfectly, of course. That leads perfectly, of course, into my next question, which was one of the questions that was put towards the Governor General, the incoming Governor General, let me be clear, about promoting national unity. We know that often the Governor General can be a somewhat unifying force. We've seen that over the course of this role within Canada's history. So she was asked about unity in Canada right now. As you point out, we are on the precipice of petitions being submitted in Alberta claiming sovereignty. Also, provincial election coming up in Quebec that could see independence at the forefront as well. What did you make of her response to that?
I thought it was understated. She said, I think there is a space for the Governor General to be conducive to dialogue, but respect moving the country forward. Again, it's such an interesting role because it is at once at the top of the pyramid within Canada, the monarch's representative in Canada, and yet a role that often is understated. I thought the exchange later on about the extent to which it's just a role for shaking hands and handing out medals, the fact that that has a certain value within a country to celebrate accomplishments, but how there is an important constitutional role here too was a striking one. And I thought also when the Prime Minister sort of leaned into the idea that one never knows what can happen, questions around minority governments, it seems as if that has been resolved for the time being, with the Liberals now having a majority, the possibility of prorogation. But we live in, it's become trite. We live in uncertain times. We don't know what the future holds. So having somebody with an expertise in the Constitution in this role being a useful one. She talked at the end about how she will reflect on this role. To what extent will Louise Arbour be simply a steady as she goes Governor General? To what extent will she try to rally Canadians around this question of national identity, which is to some extent, right, the bringing Canadians together is a part of this role? And to what extent that we just simply cannot know right now might her role wind up being more pivotal than we can imagine? I think that very much remains to be seen at this time. What I do know is we're going to be talking a lot about national unity, and it will be interesting to see the extent to which she inserts herself in that conversation.
Finally, Catherine, I wanted to ask you about another question that was put towards the Governor General, and of course we also heard the Prime Minister weigh in as well during a time when there's shifting opinions about the monarchy in this particular role. We know that Arbour was also asked about whether or not she was a monarchist. She's a francophone. She was born in Quebec, but in this role, she's representing the British Crown. So what did we make of her response to that?
I thought it was interesting in English. She said, well, it's often used as a pejorative term. I personally, having spent a chunk of my career in Quebec, being born in Quebec, wondered if that was a very Quebec lens on the term monarchist. I don't know if someone in British Columbia would necessarily say that. But she didn't really, she certainly, did not embrace that label. She said the system has worked well. A constitutional monarchy has worked well for this country. I'm proud to be a representative. I'm happy to be a representative. I want to keep the system functioning. So perhaps a disappointment for those ardent monarchists, and we know there are plenty of them in this country. But it will be interesting to see. I think fundamentally that remains a hot button issue in some corners of the country. And her remarks on that and some of the other things she said likely to be parsed in the coming days. I thought, that first question from Ashley Burke about expenses was a reminder that while it is often a ceremonial role, it can be, there can be some politically pointed questions as well. So welcome to the new role, Madame Arbour. It'll be an interesting ride.
And the Prime Minister said he'll follow up to our colleague Ashley Burke. So
there you go.
We expect more on that
Always
too.
wise to follow up with Ashley Burke. There's my 2 cents.
No doubt. Thank you for that. That is the CBC's Catherine Cullen in Ottawa. So we do want to get some more reaction to Louise Arbour's appointment as the next Governor General. As we've been saying, it is a nonpartisan role and largely ceremonial, but of course there are some politics attached to the choice of someone in that role. So for more insight on this, we've reached Peter Donolo in Toronto. He was the Director of Communications to former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Peter, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, good to be here.
Okay, first I will just get your reaction to this appointment, to Louise Arbour taking on this role.
Well, I mean, listen, she's she's one of the country's most distinguished citizens. What a career she's had, Supreme Court, United Nations. Prime Minister Chrétien appointed to the Supreme Court, and we thought that was the acme of her career. Little did we know. So I think it's, it kind of reaffirms the Office of Governor General is what it always should be, which is kind of like the capstone, the acme of a public career in Canada, the last job of an outstanding Canadian. So it does that. Secondly, having a Supreme Court justice as Governor General, first time that's ever happened, I think underlines two things. One is the safe hands approach that the Prime Minister represents to a lot of Canadians. That these are difficult times facing the country, not just in terms of the separation referendum, which you've spoken about, but I think particularly even more immediately in terms of the predatory Trump regime south of the border. So having safe hands, an institutionalist, an experienced person, fearless in this job is important at this moment. So I think, yes, I think these factors were there in the Prime Minister's calculations. I don't think Donald Trump, to the extent he pays attention to this stuff, is going to be happy with this because she is like the antithesis of what Donald Trump is. She's the same age as Donald Trump. You couldn't imagine a more different public trajectory. Her career has been all about public service. His career has been all about lining his pockets and fomenting hatred. And the fact that she's a woman who worked at the UN alone is going to get his blood pressure up, and that's fine as far as I'm concerned.
You know, typically the Governor General wouldn't necessarily deal with the U.S. president, but we do know that, for example, as the King's representative, that the King has been using some subtle messaging as well when it talks about Canada's independence and to sort of quell any sort of remarks made by the U.S. president about annexing this country. I'm wondering, because you've referenced how the U.S. president might react to this, do you think it is something that might be flagged to him, this individual? And do you think, because she is being noted as an outspoken individual as well, that there could be some sort of dialogue or down the line?
No, listen, she is super. One thing about her is she measures every word before she says it. She's a super judicious, literally, person. So she doesn't say things off the cuff. She understands her role. She understands the law, the Canada's legal structures and their constitutional responsibilities, perfectly. So I don't anticipate any of that. I just think her appointment itself is a kind of both it's a kind of a statement of what we're about as a country, and it's also a repudiation of the kind of politics that he represents. But listen, he has no more right to comment on her appointment than we have to talk about his appointment of J.D. Vance as his vice presidential candidate. But I do think that it's a kind of a statement of what we're about as a country. And Arthi, I do think that we're at the beginning of a long struggle with the Americans. We don't know where this administration is going. I personally think it's going to get darker before it gets lighter in terms of the environment for Canada and the U.S. I think it's very possible that we don't end up with a free trade agreement. The country is going to have to make some serious decisions moving forward, and I think it's important constitutionally for us to have not only a prime minister who's a grown-up and is serious about these matters, but a governor general who also understands what's at play. The prime minister and the governor general, there's a dialogue that goes on between them on a regular basis. The prime minister goes in to meet the governor general every month, every couple of months, to kind of sound out issues. Governor general presents no partisan point of view, but it represents the institutions, and with experience of someone like Louise Arbour, she could really provide a lot of value to the prime minister as he kind of wrestles with some of these very tough issues that are facing the country.
Peter, of course, as a former director of communications, it's not lost on you how important it is that people are watching how you communicate. So I'm wondering, as you watch Louise Arbour take on a role where she's very forward-facing to the media, taking some of those sometimes sharp questions as well, how you think she performed, how you think she responded. For example, there was a question about whether or not the recommendations for the Canadian Armed Forces had been implemented, and she said that, truthfully, it's not something that she had been following that closely in terms of knowing the update on those 48 recommendations. And the Prime Minister then picked up and was able to provide a more detailed response. And also there was a question about some comments that she had previously made about the war with Iran and the United States, and her response to making those questions before, of course, this role came to be for her.
I think she showed that she's got the right approach. I mean, what's a cliche? Governor General should speak in governor generalities, in the sense that the role of the Governor General is not to create excitement or controversy. The role of the Governor General is to be our nominal head of state. I'm not a monarchist, so I'll say that. And I do consider the term monarchist a bit of a pejorative term as well. But I consider our Governor General, although officially the monarch's representative in Canada, to be our nominal head of state. And I think that means that she needs to speak in language that unites people, that doesn't create controversy. And I think she's done that. Day one, an announcement. There's a difference between a good announcement and a good appointment, as a friend of mine once said. And I think, there's an excellent book out that John Fraser has written called The Governors General, about all the 13 Canadian-born Governors General, and how some of them looked like a wonderful inspired choice, and were, bombed as governors general. Others turned out really great, exceeded expectations. I think the thing about Louise Arbour is she's road tested. She's not kind of a flavor of the day. She's had a 50-year career in public life on important issues. She's a serious person. She's been vetted time and again. So she's not going to make rookie mistakes. She's going to act in an appropriate manner. I think we saw that today. And I think, as I think the point was made at the news conference, that the public activities of the Governor General, whether it's the Order of Canada presentations or traveling across the country, meeting school children, etc., it's the tip of the iceberg of the responsibilities of the Governor General. There's a lot of serious legal responsibilities there that this Governor General will understand. And as I say, given the times we're in, her experience and judgment are just a super asset for the country.
Peter, I want to thank you for your insights on this today. We always appreciate having you on.
Thanks, Arthi.
That is Peter Giannolo. He is the former Director of Communications to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, and he joined us today from Toronto. Thanks.